Chill us with EKSE, Monday to Friday, we keep on learning every day. We keep it real, Monday to Thursdays, entertainment Fridays. Just so you know, it's 5 p.m. we're going live now. Just so you know, till 6, don't touch the dial, go. Just so you know, it's 5 p.m. we're going live now. Just so you know, till 6, don't touch the dial, go. Youth Block of the Year, catch us everywhere. Hashtag line EKSE, kuzofiwa this year. Youth Block of the Year, catch us everywhere. Hashtag line EKSE, kuzofiwa this year.
Welcome to EKSE right here, channel 263. Listen, man, it is Thoughtful Thursday right here in the studio, and we are holding it down for the next hour from 5 till 6 p.m. My name is Kizia Latkana. Of course, it is Digame Tihara, and today we are covering a very important topic. It is 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which kicks off tomorrow. And we have two amazing panelists today to help us with this conversation. And later I'll be catching up with the poet, who is absolutely amazing. You do not want to miss his performance as well. And then Mihlali had the opportunity of going to the Children's Reading Book Club all the way in Khayelitsha. So that means I'm not alone. I'm here with the amazing girl. She is called Mihlali.
Oh yes, of course. Welcome you guys here to another episode of Talk Thursday right here on DSTV channel 263. Today we're talking about a very sensitive topic. So it's gender-based violence. And of course, to help us engage in this conversation, we have Uqabelo rather Dandala, who's the executive producer, not executive producer rather, but the executive director at One of One Africa. And we're also joined by actor Ashley Dowd, who's going to be telling us about the work that they do and also just getting into the conversation of gender-based violence. Why is it such a permanent and pertinent issue in South Africa? And why is it that each and every single year it seems like it's getting worse? We do know that 16 days of activism, as you've said, kicks off tomorrow. We want to see what is being done in that 16 days. Why is activism so important, and what is the importance of having these conversations? Welcome to the studio, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I feel exhausted just by looking at your introduction.
All right.
Yeah, I'm getting there.
We'll get there. We'll get there. No, definitely. We are here to make sure that we are guiding you through it all. So maybe let's start with you, Kabelo.
Yes.
Why is it so important for us to have 16 days of activism?
It's important because we need a time where we talk about this as an issue. Gender-based violence is a problem. It's not a female problem. It's a societal problem. It's a problem when half of society is living under threat. It's a problem when half of society is struggling because there are other members in the society who think they are entitled to cause harm to them. So it's important that we have a time when we stand up as a nation and as a world to say, this is not acceptable behavior. It shouldn't just be 16 days, but we are grateful that there is a time in all of our calendars across the world where we in one voice say, this is not good.
Sure. And Ashley, I have to ask you, why, well, you've mentioned the why, but what is so important about the 16 days of activism?
Well, like Kabelo said, it's not just the 16 days. I think it's much bigger than that. And I think even in the pledge that men take during this 16-day period, the list is fairly limited, because I think the complexity involved in that kind of violence extends to all sorts of psychosocial, individual issues that men have to deal with. And it's important that they stop themselves and reflect back on what's happening here, because I don't think it's not a happy person that engages in violence. And I think you need to look at yourself and to start reflecting on what can change in yourself before that can change. It's no good just saying stop hitting women, or whatever the case is. It's to say let's turn the torch on yourself. Be man enough to do that, right?
And I mean, this campaign, 16 Days of Activism, it's an annual thing. Each and every single year, we I don't want to say commemorate, but we get together and we raise awareness around gender-based violence, and we try to end what I would like to believe is a national crisis. What has changed from last year to this year? Because gender-based violence is so exhausting. Each and every single year you hear that women are being killed in the streets, you hear that young children, are suffering. What has been done? What changed, if there is any, have you seen within the progression from last year until now?
Well, look, let me speak in terms of the work that we are doing and what has changed. And what has changed for us is to say we cannot talk about gender-based violence without engaging men in this conversation. And so what has changed for us is that we've decided it's important that we deliberately, proactively engage men, not just as the people we view as perpetrators, but to engage men as people alongside us who are also saying, this is not good enough. There has to be better. We have to stop this. Because oftentimes men are seen as, the enemy. And the truth of the matter is it's not every man.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we highlight that gender-based behavior is not a norm. And so we need to have men who stand up and say, I don't participate in this. And so for us, what has changed is that we are now inviting men to be part of this conversation, to say, this is not correct behavior, and how do we as a society change it? And this is why it's so exciting to have people like Ashley part of that conversation with us to say, we need men starting to say as well, this is not acceptable behavior.
And with men contributing to the conversation, Ashley, please tell us what the positive impact of 16 Days of Activism has contributed and will be as well.
Well, for me, I think just in understanding what this organization is about, my initial reservation was, what has changed? Like you asked just now, what has changed? And how do you go about not just preaching to the converted? Because that was my fear. Like, people stand up and they talk, and the people that are engaging with that are the ones that aren't really the perpetrators of that kind of violence. So what is happening? And Libelo, unpacked a lot of the programs that are coming out of this, which I'm sure you'll discuss, that are influential in change, in making change happen. So I think that's important. That discussion comes into the 16 days as well.
Most definitely. And I think before we even speak of gender-based violence, I think it's very important for people to even understand what gender-based violence is. So Kabela, would you say, because I think, I'm not sure, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is gender-based violence also inclusive of men? Because I do know that it's also inclusive of the LGBTQI community.
Correct.
Or is it just violence that's perpetrated on women? What is gender-based violence?
It is violence that is perpetuated, or let me put it simply, it is violence on people of a particular gender who are seen as a particular gender, often seen as a lesser or an inferior or a less powerful gender. And this is why, for example, women easily fall into that. But then gender, as we know, does not speak about our physiology.
Of course.
There are people who see themselves as female but are not maybe physiologically then female. Hence we have the conversation with the LGBTQI community. And
sorry, I just need to cut you right there because we are running out of time, but we are coming back for the conversation.
EKSE Live on DSTV channel 263. The topic of the day is gender-based violence. It's hashtag Talk Thursday. And as joining for this much needed conversation within society. So not only is Bandela joining us for this conversation, but we'll continue the conversation with the executive director of One of One, Sis Kabelo, and of course an actor, Ashley, who have been speaking to us about the importance of having this day. And we're just going to continue the conversation because gender-based violence is a big problem in South Africa.
It really is, and I really enjoyed just hearing you guys' insights, but I feel like we have so much more to talk about. Now I want to find out, what is the goal of activism, rather?
Well, the goal of this campaign, which is One Man Can, is really to alert people to the fact that a single man can be a role model to other men around him and his environment, to say not all men participate in gender-based violence, and that there are many men who say gender-based violence is not okay. So that's really what the campaign is about, to get individual men pledging, and hopefully we having a ripple effect so that they are then role models in their communities, in their environments, in their spaces, to say there are good men out there and gender-based violence is not okay.
And there are so many campaigns and organizations that do incredible work to stand up against gender-based violence, but we still see each and every single year there is a rise of the cases that are reported of women that are being subjected to gender-based violence, and children even. There's this page that I follow on Instagram, I think it's Women for Change SA, and literally each and every single hour there's a new story of a child that was killed, a woman that was raped, and all those gruesome stories. Why do you think that the situation is getting worse instead of getting better?
Well, I think that's a huge question. I mean, it's just compounded by so many issues in our country and in countries all over the world. But I mean, like I said a little bit earlier, it comes down to that unhappiness that the individual feels about his own life, the person that's perpetuating that kind of violence. You know, what is that? Not everybody, and that's where, you know, being an actor and approaching a character is quite interesting, because if you're going to play a villain or a baddie, he's not two-dimensional bad. He's not just nasty.
Yeah.
Something has happened to that individual, and you've got to work backwards from that.
Yeah.
And I mean, recently, in a similar way, I was listening to someone talking about going to hear episodes and interviews with restorative justice, people coming out of Pollsmoor prison,
Right.
and saying these people have to get to the point where they understand what's happening, realize it, and understand the kind of work that has to happen before that can change. And it's very difficult. You know, it's easy just to continue what you've been doing, but it's very difficult to stop yourself and say, okay, I'm man enough to actually confront what I'm going through here and my unhappiness. And even if I feel small in confronting this, and I don't feel masculine or macho or anything about it, I have to do it. Otherwise, life is not going to change.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. And I have to agree that firstly, it starts with organizations, but more importantly, it's about the person dealing with themselves and actually holding themselves accountable to be like, I have a problem, and let me actually speak to people who might know how to help me.
Yeah.
Now, what I want to find out, looking at the bigger scheme of things, is the government doing enough to combat gender-based violence?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, because there certainly is an acknowledgement. But no, because there are a lot of supportive systems that should be in place that are simply not in place. But I think what that then does is that it places responsibility on us as the citizens, as the individuals, as civil society, to say, what can we do? Because government does not operate in isolation.
Absolutely.
It works within communities, within spaces, and we occupy those spaces. I mean, if you look at apartheid, for example, it was no single government that did that. It was individuals, civil society, people at individual level fighting. And this is something that we have to, at all levels, fight. Hence, we have a campaign as One-to-One Africa. Hence, we then have individuals like Ashley who are participating in that campaign to say, one man can.
You know, when we speak of the legal system in South Africa, I feel like it's very frustrating because you find that perpetrators, you know, they'll go to court and then they'll get bail, and then it really is demotivating and discouraging to women that are survivors of gender-based violence to see your perpetrator walking down the road when you know that he's done such a gruesome act against you. Maybe perhaps for someone that is really frustrated, you know, because even going to the police, we've heard so many stories of women saying that I don't feel comfortable to go to the police because, you know, it's either I get discriminated against, or there's something that nothing good comes out of it. What are some of the alternatives that you know, citizens can approach organizations or projects that they can be a part of to help them you know, get through this national crisis that we face in South Africa?
Well, you know, just to use the analogy that you used about apartheid, using stereotypes and perpetuating the mythology of what's happening out there, the masculinity and the so-called masculinity, and I'm talking about things like men in their clubs and groups, just perpetuating this idea that men should be superior, or they, you know, it's okay to maybe indulge in that kind of violence because it's, you know, there has to be times when a man actually, you know, says this is not on, this is not right.
And in fact, what we are doing is, as of next year, we're actually launching a program in our organization called Engaging Men. Because what we are doing is we are engaging men in their spaces. So we are going out into spaces where men are to start having these conversations, to start changing the narrative and the conversation, and just bring it to their attention that there is a way of being a man without being violent, without being a perpetrator of gender-based violence. It cannot be a once-off thing.
Welcome back to EKSE right here, channel 263. Man, we've been having such an amazing conversation.
Absolutely.
And if you weren't standing by, don't worry, we are still yet to continue that conversation. So tomorrow begins a very important campaign for South Africa, the 16 Days of Activism.
Yes.
And if you didn't already know, 16 Days of Activism runs every year from the 25th of November to the 10th of December, starting with International Day of No Violence Against Women and ending with International Human Rights Day. The campaign runs its awareness to raise gender-based violence, of course, against women and children, and its goal is to aid and rid society of the abuse permanently.
Yeah.
Which is, you know,
Which is a dream that should
amazing.
be coming true, yeah.
Exactly,
And we
yes.
have people in the studio today who are all about making sure that that dream comes to life, not just thinking it, but making sure that they are finding ways to infiltrate us as South Africa and making us a better nation. Please welcome to the show yet again. I mean, this is our third segment. This is not the first time. If you've just joined us, then this is your first segment. But I want to find out, what is One of One doing for the 16 Days of Activism?
So 121 is running a campaign on social media where we are inviting men to take a pledge that says, I will not be defensive. I will not raise my hand against women. I will check in with myself in terms of my mental health and my own joy and happiness. And all this information actually is on our website, 121africa.org/men. And we are inviting men from all walks of life to join in this campaign and to just post a video of themselves actually making this pledge and then tag us on socials at 121 Africa.
121 Africa, absolutely.
And Ashley, I have a question to ask you, right? There's so many abuse happening with women, with kids, as well as with men as well. And I want to ask you, what would you consider being abuse that people in the general public would not consider being abuse?
Well, I think the first thing you think about is physical violence. But the other thing is verbal abuse. And maybe, I mean, one of the pledges is that I will respect your boundaries.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Which is it's very interesting because if you don't respect someone's boundaries, however you fence in that person is effectively abuse.
Yeah.
You know?
Sure.
So I actually wanted to find out again, I want to dive into that because mostly when people think of abuse, we think of physical abuse, but I feel like there's one that is just as bad as on the same level is where it comes to mental abuse because then that ties you for such a long time. And you may not even know, like you might be having a conversation with someone else, they're like, actually that's not normal. And you're like, no man, it should be normal. You know what I'm saying?
And I feel like, just to add, the mental one like really holds you the most. I feel like it really triggers and it bars the body and the mind for the longest time.
Absolutely does. And I think all the more reason why it's important that as part of talking about the 16 Days of Activism, like Ashley was saying earlier, we need to do a check-in with self.
Yeah.
Men need to do a check-in with self, mental health, psychosocial wellness, and women as well. Everyone needs to do that.
Yeah.
Because you will not really know that you are a victim until you actually check in with yourself.
Right.
And you check what your so-called norms are or aren't.
Yeah.
Even for the perpetrators, you won't know until you check in with yourself. And the truth is, a happy person does not cause harm physically, verbally, or psychologically to any other person.
Yeah.
And just on knowing yourself, right? What would you say, Ashley, knowing your rights in terms of 16 Days of Activism and your place in it?
Sure, that's a huge question for me to answer. Knowing your rights and your place in those 16 days of activism. Well, I mean, for me, it just comes down to the most logical, you know, and I love the fact that we're both talking about happiness because it's about what puts you in a place where you're not happy anymore.
Yeah.
And if you're not in that place, you have a right to be happy. You have a right to exist in a way that you give expression to individually as yourself. I mean, if someone is not allowing you that, then you know that's something that you need to stand up for.
Right. You need to stand up for it, ladies and gents. Hopefully you guys have been learning a lot from that conversation. Before I let you go, though, let's talk about your movie.
show.
Yes.
I have 1 minute.
Well, okay, it's on stage. It's
Yeah.
called A Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
It's an old classic, but it's a classic, beautiful, heartwarming classic.
Okay.
It's about this old, mean, twisted individual who gets shaken by these visitations. These spirits come to him. And I mean, think about this. Imagine you're going through that whatever it is,
Yeah.
knocks you sideways. And eventually, you have to confront these things that you did in your past. And you revisit people in your past that you wanted to revisit.
Okay.
And he comes back a new man with new eyes.
A new man, even the voice.
And becomes a happy man again.
Yeah.
So it's called The Christmas Carol. It's at Theatre on the Bay.
Yeah.
And you can get tickets from CompuTicket.
Tickets from CompuTicket.
You heard it right there.
Yeah.
Are you going?
Yeah.
Girl, front row, front seat, right there, B. Do make sure that you go as well and go and purchase a ticket at CompuTicket. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you
you
for
guys
sitting
so
down,
much.
indulging in this amazing conversation.